The Dzinzi Indian is a very rare opening that's not seen a lot at the highest levels. And to me, as an advocate of the opening, that's absolutely fantastic because not a lot of people are studying it. And why is this? Well, part of the reason is in the background there have been rumors and murmurs about, oh, that opening's been refuted. But I doubt anyone could actually tell you what the quote refutation was. I actually prefer an opening that's not in the glare of the theoretical spotlight. Much less attention is paid to it. People don't have the latest Anand or Kramnik or Kasparov game to follow in terms of looking how to play against it. So many white players are very, very unprepared to meet it. And yet, it offers a dynamic imbalance. At a very early stage, black gives up his bishop, he doubles white's c-pawns. In databases, against almost every response, black has at least 50%, which is pretty amazing. And white does have a broad number of responses. However, there's only 2 or 3 responses that we actually consider to be theoretically challenging, perhaps e4, some attempts with h4, and an early queen a4. These look to be the most challenging theoretically, and in each case we will show you how to handle the position with black. With a careful study of this chess DVD, you will learn the plans, the tactics, the history of the Dzinzi Indian, and you will be able to win many, many games against very surprised white opponents. Hi, I'm International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley. Today we're going to look at a fantastic opening that you can play when white plays 1d4. It's called the Dzinzi Indian, named after Roman Dzindzichashvili. And it starts when white plays 1d4. d4 is a very good move for white. It helps to control the center. And we can see the e5 and the c5 squares. And with black, we respond with 1g6. We prepare to fianchetto our bishop to g7. White plays c4 and establishes a very nice pawn duo. This gives him control of e5, d5, c5, and b5 for the moment. For black, we fianchetto our bishop and we immediately begin to put pressure on white's d4 pawn. White plays knight to c3. This developing knight move has been chosen by white players about 67% of the time. From c3 we can see the knight influences the d5 and the e4 squares. And now, as black, we counterattack at the center. Our pawn on c5, combined with our bishop on g7, puts pressure on white's d4 pawn and immediately forces him to make a decision. d5 has been white's choice about 80% of the time. From d5 we can see that the pawn covers the c6 and the e6 squares, but this also opens up for our fianchettoed bishop on the dark squares and gives us the option of bishop takes knight check. In fact, this is kind of a key moment in establishing our Dzinzi Indian defense, is we do in fact give up our long-range bishop for the knight on c3. After bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, we can see white has these double pawns on c3 and c4, and white is ready to expand in the center with e2 to e4. And black also has these dark squares that are a little bit weak now because of the absence of his bishop that was on g7. With f5, we immediately fight for the light squares, and in particular the vitally important e4 center square. And this is the key starting position for the Dzinzi Indian. If allowed, black will now play d6, knight f6, queen a5, knight bd7, and then this is important. For d7, this knight can either go to e5 if available. As a rule, you want to go to e5 if it's available, or to b6. In either case, we can see that this knight immediately attacks the white pawn on c4. So let's say, for example, we have to put our knight on b6. Then the way we follow up our development is with bishop d7 and castles. This is the development plan for black. From here, he may look to advance his e-pawn. He may look to drop his queen back, attack the white pawn on c4. And black has, very, very good position. Now, of course, we made several moves for black. White will be trying to do something in the meantime. And what we will look at in this introduction is that once we reach this position with f5, we know what our plan is. We know where our pieces belong. We know what we're trying to do. But it takes two people to play a chess game. We will then take a look to see what white does, and we will meet each of his plans. So in this DVD, we will show you how to play the Dzinzi Indian, and we will cover all of the different pawn moves that white has on the 6 moves to try and make progress against our fantastic opening. The first white response we will look at is 6 e3. I call this the, quote, passive approach. But nonetheless, a lot of players do play like this. And what's white's reasoning? Well, first he develops a pawn in front of his king, and he likes to get his bishop to d3, maybe his knight to f3, and try to develop the king side. A lot of players, when first confronted with an opening they're not familiar with, they quite often play a move like e3. Now, what's the downside to e3? Well, e3 blocks in the queen's bishop. As we can see, the bishop only has this square, d2, and b2. Once you play e3, you've really blocked this guy in. Notice that f4, g5, and possibly h6 have all now been blocked by the white pawn on e3. Kind of reminds me of Edward Gufeld mentioned that you should talk to your pieces. White should actually ask the bishop on c1, Mr. Bishop, do you mind if I put a pawn on e3 and block your diagonal? If you were to have a conversation like that, I don't think too many players would play e3. But at the moment, you meet e3 fairly frequently. Players that haven't given it a lot of deep thought, quite often this is the type of move they will play. So we understand with e3, white wants to develop his kingside pieces. How should we as black meet this plan or development setup for white? Well, we should play d6. The pawn on d6 immediately blocks the white pawn and frees the d7 square for our pieces. We should bring our knight out to f6. From f6 it controls the e4 and g4 squares. We should play our queen to a5. On a5 we immediately put pressure on the pawn on c3. We should bring our other knight to d7. From d7 we see it can go to b6 or to e5 if possible, and put more pressure on the white c4 pawn. But let's say we have to put our knight on b6. Let's say the e5 square is covered by white. Then our bishop normally goes to d7. From d7 it covers the b5 square, the a4 square, and prepares for our king to be able to castle queenside. More times than not, we will actually castle queenside where we have more pieces and a very nice fortress. And then from there, what's our game plan? Our game plan quite often is to break in the center with e6, just activating our bishop. And sometimes we drop the queen back to a6, where it helps the knight put more pressure on the white c-pawn. That's our game plan. In game 1, we're going to take a look at this game plan for black in action. First game we will look at, game 1, Saha Surajit is playing white against Gurpreet Singh. This was played in Bangladesh 2004 and was a tournament sponsored by the United Insurance Company. Played in round 7. Let's take a look. d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, c5, attacking the white center, d5, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, f5, fighting for control of e4, and now white played 6 e3. How do we respond? Well, first things first, we played d6. White plays bishop e2 now. A little bit different idea than what we thought. We thought he was going to play bishop d3. Knight f6 and h4. So white combines a fairly passive plan of e3 with a fairly aggressive plan of h4, trying to open the h-file. Of course, one question is, what's the future home for his king? Black continues with the program, queen a5 attacking the pawn on c3. White now plays queen b3. In my mind, this is actually one of the more logical places for white to place the queen. Protects all 3 pawns that are weak on the queen side, a2, c3, c4, and potentially counterattacks the black pawn on b7. I tend to think that queen to b3 is actually one of white's better choices for a queen move to defend the c3 pawn. Again, black continues with the program, knight to d7. From there he can go to b7. Again, black continues with the program, knight to d7. From d7 he can go to e5 or b6. White now plays a little interesting idea, knight h3, kind of the flank development of the knight, with the idea that he can go to f4 or to g5, and from there, either point, he can continue on to e6. Black decides to play knight b6. I may have given slight preference to putting the knight on e5, but knight to b6 is good. Knight to f4. And now here black plays a very interesting idea. Most people would actually play bishop to d7. Black actually invests a move to play rook g8, figuring white's going to open the h-file, or white's going to come into e6. If he comes to e6, he's probably thinking that he will eliminate the knight in one move with his bishop and have saved a move moving his rook away from the h-file. White plays f3. Now again, he's moving another pawn in front of his king, but quite often the king will find its haven on f2. Bishop d7, this prepares for queenside castling. Bishop d2, not a proud moment in the life of this bishop, but again, it goes back to the pawn structure. With pawns on e3 and c3, where is this bishop supposed to go? Black castles queenside and has now completed his development in very harmonious fashion. White plays king f2 and also connects his two rooks. And now here black plays queen a4, offering the potential trade of queens, but also increasing the pressure on c4. Rook at a to b1, logical. Rook backs up the queen, creates a battery on the half-open b-file. Rook at d to e8. Very nice. Black prepares either e6 or e5, with a break in the center, forcing white to make a decision. White plays rook b2. Black opts for e5. This establishes a very nice pawn duo on e5 and f5, and actually gives black a space advantage in the center of the board. White, of course, does have the pawn takes pawn en passant option, which, in this game, white takes advantage of that French rule, captures, black recaptures. Now white does give up his knight for his bishop, but black now gets the open file to double on for his rooks, and the white pawn on e3 suddenly becomes a target. Queen b5, black doubles rooks on the half-open e-file, bishop d3. Now we notice that the c4 square is pretty hotly contested. Black has two attackers attacking, and white has two defenders defending. So black now finds a very nice solution. How can he bring a third unit to attack this pawn on c4? And notice that if he does bring a third unit to attack, it's very hard for white to bring a third defender. And the solution is the agile black knight. Drops back to d7. From d7, it threatens to go to e5, and once on e5, it would threaten both the bishop on d3, and it would be the third attacker on the pawn on c4. In fact, if the knight gets to e5, we can see the pawn on c4 is practically surrounded. Fritz, in fact, after knight d7, already considers that black is almost 8/10 of a pawn better. In order to stop the knight from coming to e5, white plays pawn to f4, covering the e5 square. However, the drawback to putting the pawn on e4 is immediately shown because after knight to f6, we can see the e4 and f4 squares have been irreparably weakened. This is the thing with pawns. Once you move them forward, you cannot move them backwards. In fact, the threat immediately is to just play knight to g4 check. As we mentioned, the pawn on e3 is very, very weak. White decides to bring his rook over, lend some support, and black now plays knight to e4 check. A very powerful move, occupying the central outpost, completely boxing in the two bishops, and of course if white exchanges, rook takes, and then the pawn on c4 is absolutely indefensible. However, let's go back one moment. And here, black missed a very nice opportunity. Knight to g4 check. This would have three attackers bearing down on the pawn on e3. 1, 2, 3. With only two defenders and the king. The question then is, where does the king go? If white tries to continue defending his pawn with a third defender, that's 1, 2, 3. black now has a fantastic finish. Queen to d1 check. A beautiful deflection motif. We can see this immediately puts the king in check. And of course, after rook takes queen, you then have rook takes e3 check, bishop takes e3, and rook takes e3 mate. As we can see, the knight and the rook combine to form a beautiful checkmate on the king. Let's go back for 1 minute. Instead of rook d1, let's say after queen to d1 check, let's say black saw that and decided to try and duck with king g3. Too late. Queen takes e1 check, another deflection motif, and after bishop takes on e1, rook takes on e3, and again, similar type checkmate. Notice that the knight is covering both of the king's escape squares. Beautiful coordination between the black pieces. This would have been a very, very nice, very thematic finish. Let's just take another look. Knight e4 check was a strong move. Knight to g4 check was a totally crushing move. But continuing on, after knight e4 check, black certainly has all the positional trumps, and after king to f3, h5. Very nice move. Completely locks up the king side, blockades the position. This bishop is now buried for life. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns of his own that are locked on the same color. This bishop is just basically sentenced to being passive for the rest of its life. White continued on with bishop to d1. King c7, black gradually nurses his pieces forward. Bishop d3, and now black decides that he can actually go ahead and exchange queens. Pawn takes, and white actually feels like he's straightened out his pawns a little bit here. However, c4, very powerful move. This keeps the pawns frozen on the dark squares. White retreats with bishop to f1. Just take a quick note. Of course, bishop takes and rook takes check is not really a position for discussion because this bishop is just simply so bad. This knight can hop all around, it can attack everything at once, it might even maneuver knight a5 to c4 to d3. It has all the possibilities. Let's just take a look. It could go a4, c5, and into d3. This knight has all the mobility in the world. This bishop is basically stuck like a pawn. So of course, white at least keeps his good bishop, but after d5, rook c2, knight a4. Very nice. The two knights coordinate to attack c3. The black king even gets into the game. Very important to remember, in the endgame, the king has the attacking power of about 3.5 points. That is to say, it's actually, as an attacking piece, slightly stronger than knights or bishops. Black already at this point has a decisive advantage. White no longer has a viable defense. In the game, white retreated with bishop to c1. Black went ahead and took the first fruits. One pawn on c3, and the other one on b5 is actually attacked as well. After bishop to b2, notice that if white had tried to defend this pawn, black could just simply play king up, and on a3, play king c5, and he's ready to go ahead and collect it without even worrying about getting pinned. So in the game, after bishop b2, at least attacking the knight, black went ahead and collected a second pawn, and after knight a4, knight bd6, black has a completely winning position. And in fact, white did play on to move 60, but we're going to continue on with more important things to look at. This is a completely dominating winning position. Black even is considered to be 3 pawns up, according to Fritz. So let's do a quick recap. White's h-pawn advance was met by this rook to g8 move. We will see this type of idea later on when we look at 6h4. Another key idea that we learned in this game, black employed the maneuver rook at d to e8, and then, on his next move, he made the e5 pawn advance, establishing a very nice pawn duo in the center. Very important motif, this e5 or e6 center break. The next key idea is we see black is attacking the c4 pawn twice, white is defending it twice. How to bring a third attacker to bear. And black solved the problem very nicely with knight to d7. This knight d7 to e5 maneuver is very powerful and very good idea to keep in mind. Notice when white answered this with f4 that after knight f6, the g4 and e4 squares were irreparably weakened. Almost always this f4 advance is not good for white. This was an important moment in the game. White played the very powerful, very strong knight e4 check. However, in this position, he missed a huge golden opportunity with knight g4 check, 3 attackers on the e3 pawn, and after king f3, pretty much the only way to defend the pawn, the very nice deflection sacrifice, queen d1 check, rook d1, rook e3 check, bishop e3, and rook takes e3 mate. Again, a critical moment. Knight e4 check, a very strong move. Knight g4 check, a crushing move. This is an important technique. In this position, black is winning on the queen side. Stands better in the center with the beautiful doubled rooks on the half-open e-file and the occupation. And on the king side, he simply locks it up. An important motif to keep in mind. And here is one of the final things that we really should take away from this game. Normally you would not exchange queens if it allows white to undouble his pawns. However, in this case, the immediate follow-up with c4, bishop back to f1, and d5 still kept white locked in the box, and if anything, after a few more moves, we saw that the pawn on b5 actually became rather overextended, and the black king had very rapid access to attack it. So again, exchanging queens always has to be carefully considered, and in this case he even undoubled the pawns, but allowed his pieces to come on into the game and attack white's pawn weaknesses. Overall, a very, very instructive game. Thank you for spending time with us on the Dzinzi Indian. So far, on this first video, we've looked at d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, c5, d5, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, f5. Of the white 6-move alternatives, we've looked at the passive approach, e3. We've looked at the kingside fianchetto with g3, and we've also looked at f3, preparing for e4. In Volume 2, we will look at what I call the big theoretical challenge, 6e4, at one time thought to actually be the tactical refutation. In Volume 3, we will look at h-file action with h4, at one time thought to be the positional or strategical refutation. Also in Volume 3, we will cover the combined e4, for example, f takes e4 and h4, when white combines e4 and h4 type action. In future volumes, we will cover preparing for g4, for example with h3. We will also cover the g4 gambit, the d-pawn push, and we will look at the knight developments, the normal knight development and the clever knight development, knight to h3. We will also look at bishop moves. Bishop to f4 was actually played against me by a Russian master, and bishop to g5 with pressure on e7. And last but not least, we will look at queen moves. Queen a4 pins the d-pawn, covers a5, queen c2 has been played, and queen to d3. Then we come to the situation where white players don't play d5. After c5, they have what I call the Dzinzi Indian declined. For example, they play d takes c5. However, of course, here we play bishop c3, bc3, queen a5, and this is what I call the tripled pawns variation. Also, instead of d5, there's e3, the passive approach, and 4, f3, the positional approach. We will also be covering those in future DVDs. And then, going to the very beginning, nothing so frustrating as not being able to reach your favorite opening. We have what I call the Dzinzi Indian avoided, where white doesn't even play c4. Instead, he plays 2e4. Of course, we will have some suggestions for you as to what I like to play and look at some games and so forth. There's also 2 knight f3, and then you have your dyed-in-the-wool queen pawn players who basically play d4 and bishop g5 against anything. Thank you again for spending time with us on the Dzinzi Indian.